On this story, we can bring in Andreas, Krieg, Assistant Professor of Defence Studies at King's College London. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. What is Israel's strategy here? Why sort of suggest an imminent ground invasion and then backtrack?
Hi, good afternoon. Well, if you ask me, I think Israel has no strategy, neither a political one and not really a military one either, because strategy involves a political endgame. Strategy involves making sure that the threat that you're up against is actually really targeted at its root rather than just at the symptoms. And the root cause of all that violence that we're seeing is a political one. It's nothing to do with Hamas. Hamas is responding to what is an ongoing, for decades ongoing, elements of ethnic cleansing, elements of a of a one-state solution where citizens have actually not the same rights. These political issues, these societal issues where Palestinians feel alienated, not part of the country, is actually the root cause of the violence that we're seeing. And Israel is not engaging with that. What they're doing now is coming up with an operational military plan to deal with rocket fire. And that's kind of the extent to which Israel is actually engaging at the moment in the Gaza Strip. So they're using remote warfare for the most part, and it remains remote for this point in time. So using drones, using jets, using naval fire, as well as using increasingly artillery fire as well. And this is where the ground troops come in. But what we see is that the ground troops that are being used, although some of them that have been called up are combat troops, have actually not entered Gaza. I think it's part of a diversion plan or confusion plan by the Israeli military, bringing out people into the open last night in anticipation of a ground invasion and then to strike from the air. So we haven't seen any of that yet. I think Israel is very wary that obviously if they get into the urban environment of Gaza, this would be a very, very costly operation, costly in terms of life, in terms of financial costs, in terms of reputational and political costs. And we've seen that in 2014, Israel didn't perform very well. And obviously, Hamas is very much at an advantage at such close range. And let's not forget, in 2014, the Israelis were willing to pay the price because they had three youngsters kidnapped and they were hoping to actually get them back. This is not the situation at the moment. So I think the acceptance for risks and costs in Israel is very low in comparison to 2014.
Is it fair to assume that over the next 3 days until the UN Security Council discusses the tensions in the Middle East, that the short-term goal for Israel is to get rid of Hamas infrastructure and target those tunnels?
Absolutely. I think this is exactly what it is. The operational plan that Israel has been using in Gaza is, again, not a strategic one, is one of what they call mowing the lawn, which is about, cutting the grass and then waiting for it to grow back and then cut it again. And obviously that comes at the expense of thousands of Palestinians' lives in Gaza. But it doesn't provide a strategic endgame. It's not an endgame in itself because, again, it doesn't solve the root cause of it. So destroying the infrastructure, the communications, as well as destroying arsenals of rockets, and obviously these launch pads that they're using is the objective here. But again, this can only bring you quiet for the short to mid-term, not in the long term. So long-term, Israel needs to engage in some sort of political dialogue, and not only over Gaza and Hamas, but also particularly over the West Bank and Palestine and a potential two-state solution, which for all we can see at the moment is very much dead from an Israeli point of view.
Speaking of a political endgame, all this is going to play in the Prime Minister's favor, the Israeli Prime Minister's favor, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's hanging on to his job by a thread after he could not form the next coalition government.
Absolutely. I mean, both sides. I mean, if you look, again, this all started in Jerusalem. This is about ethnic cleansing. This is about taking over East Jerusalem and driving out Palestinian people. This is how the protests erupted. It was about Al-Aqsa, but police violence. But really, those antagonists that we're seeing at the moment going head-to-head is Hamas and Israel. And obviously Israel and Hamas are both, the Israeli government as well as the Hamas leadership are in a political game here, where they're trying to secure domestic support in Palestine, which is Hamas going into elections, as well as Bibi Netanyahu, who actually already lost the elections, already lost the mandate to form a government, and is now under pressure and trying to use this as a way to kind of buy political capital domestically. And it seems to be working in his favor, because we've seen this morning that the potential alternative coalition is breaking apart, and Netanyahu might go into a fifth election in a very short period of time. That might again bring him back as the next prime minister. And that is obviously part of the problem. The Palestinians who are dying at the moment are dying for a political battle for domestic gain, for both on the side of Hamas as well as on the side of the Israeli government.
And why, in your opinion, is Hamas the preferred partner of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Because it feeds into this narrative.
Why Hamas is the preferred partner?
Yeah, essentially. Because he likes this period of lull and war.
So Hamas... Absolutely. I mean, so what Hamas is doing, obviously, is very much playing into the hands of Bibi Netanyahu. Both sides, we need to see them as both quite extremist, radical factions. Those people who keep the Netanyahu government alive in Israel are feeding off violence, are feeding off violent narratives, as well as Hamas is feeding off violence, feeding off violent narratives, because that kind of gives them a reason for being. Bibi has always fed off being kind of the strong guy who's pushing through ethno-nationalist Israeli narratives. And the same goes for Hamas, quite radical elements, trying to bring through a only Palestinian solution, never one that is actually looking at a combined diplomatic solution. So they kind of feed off each other, and they have done so for many, many years.
Andreas Krieg, thank you very much for joining us on the program today. In other news, at least 12 people have